In January of this year, The Guardian ran a piece in which it asked a number of British musicians and a few other people who their favourite Malian artists were, who their favourite Malian musicians were. They asked people like Robert Del Naja from Massive Attack, John McClure, Johnny Marr. They asked Kerris Matthews, who's now best known as being a Six Music DJ, and Emily Evis, who programmes Glastonbury. And the people that they name-checked and the discussion that they had was pretty good. If you know a bit about the contemporary Malian music scene, it's all the sort of the big names that you'd expect. It was, you know, people like Omar Sangari, Amadou Mariam, Ali Farkatouri, Fatoumata Diawara, Rocky Traore, and so on. Brilliant, I thought. Brilliant to see West African music being discussed in a serious way in The Guardian. Brilliant to see a number of very talented and outspoken female artists name-checked. West African music, like music from many other parts of the world, can be quite male-dominated. What a progressive piece, I thought. But then I asked myself, why now? Why is The Guardian running this piece now? And the answer is that Islamists had taken over parts of the north of Mali and had banned music. Now, so far as I'm concerned, banning music is almost always a bad thing to do. It's good that The Guardian drew our attention to the fact that this was happening. The problem, though, is that the way that the piece was framed in the introduction, written by Ian Birrell, who's actually one of the co-founders of Africa Express, played into a narrative whereby Western intervention was seen to be some sort of a good thing. It played into a narrative whereby the British public were being softened up to the idea of greater levels of Western intervention into this part of the world. This is what he said in the introduction to that Guardian piece. It took bombing raids from French aircraft to draw attention to the fact that Islamist extremists have captured 2/3 of this beautiful country, imposing a distorted and destructive interpretation of their faith on a people for whom it could not be more alien. Now, there's two problems with this. The first thing to say is that actually the situation on the ground in Mali was a bit more complicated than the article suggests. As well as the Islamists, the Tuareg had also taken parts of Mali, and the Tuareg actually have some quite legitimate grievances with the Malian military dictatorship, and incidentally they produce quite a lot of good music. A number of bands that have gone on to become WOMAD favourites. Tinarawen is probably the best known. The second and more important problem is that French bombs never fall in the interests of ordinary Malians, that Western military intervention is never in the interests of West Africans. The French and the British were getting involved in this part of the world not because they cared about the ordinary people. They wanted some political purchase on this part of the world because this part of the world is rich in oil and gas and uranium. This was imperialism at work, and we need to be very clear about that. Now, I wanted to start this talk with that story for two reasons. Firstly, it's often the case that when we talk about the relationship between music and politics, you have to dig beneath the surface appearance of things in order to get a full understanding of what's going on politically. The relationship between culture and society is never a straightforward, deterministic one. It's always a complicated one that you have to unpick. And the second reason why I wanted to begin with this story is because I think it underlines the fact that if you want to understand anything about this part of the world, you have to start by trying to get your head around not only imperialism or neo-colonialism now, but also the largely devastating effects of colonialism, and before that the transatlantic slave trade, which so depopulated this area, 20 million people over 3 centuries, and it retarded the economic development of this area in ways that this meeting doesn't have time to go into. But I think it's fair to say that despite the courageous fight back by many people over many years, that capitalism in its different forms has been particularly cruel to this part of the world, and its beginnings could hardly have been more cruel. This is how Karl Marx described it. The turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins signalled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist accumulation. Now, this meeting will focus on music from West Africa, or music that has been listened to and has been influential in West Africa. But it's worth saying that when we're talking about music of resistance, it's worth saying that some of the most famous music of resistance to poverty, to racism, to oppression and to war has come from the descendants of people forced against their will from this part of the world. I'm thinking of reggae in Jamaica, I'm thinking of hip-hop and soul in the US, I'm thinking of the political samba that you get in Bahia, in Brazil, and so on. So West Africa has had, albeit an indirect, it's had a huge influence on music from elsewhere. But it's also true that other parts of the world have had a big, or had a significant impact on the music of West Africa. People have gone to West Africa not only as colonialists, but also as missionaries, as traders, as soldiers positioned there in the world wars and so on. And all these people have brought with them their music and their musical instruments. And so there are some types of music that we might think of as being quintessentially West African that are actually a synthesis of different influences from different parts of the world, high life in Ghana, Juju in Nigeria, and so on. So the relationship between this part of the world and, in particular, colonial and imperialist countries is one of the themes running through this talk. But the other thing to say is that we shouldn't romanticise the West Africa which existed prior to colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, because for at least 2,000 years a majority of West Africans lived in quite rigidly structured class societies. It's true that prior to that they would have lived in more egalitarian societies, possibly without class, the sort of societies that Frederick Engels described as primitive communists. But for the last 2,000 years, West Africans have, for the most part, lived in class societies. And this is important if we want to understand the story of music, because the traditional musician families, the Griots or the Jali families, were quite low down in that class hierarchy. And the only way that they could put bread on the table was by singing praises to the people at the top of the pile. Now, that wasn't the only role that they played. They also documented social history and so on and so forth. But traditional West African music has as a very central component praise singing. And this isn't just a historical thing. I made an album with a Senegalese kora player, a guy called Doudou Sissoko. I'll just play you a little bit in the background. Quietly, I'll talk over the top. In fact, you know what? I think I've even got a picture of me and him on Lake with Jules Holland. There you go, a young Dave Randall with a Doudou Sissoko. Now, one of the songs that we played was written by his great-grandfather in praise of the last king of the Manding Empire. In fact, this is the song. And it's not just traditional chiefs and kings that get praised. There's an interesting book by an American guitarist called Banning Eyre, who went to live in Mali with the Malian guitarist Jenny Madi Tunkara. And it's a good book, but one of the scenes that he describes is a scene that played out when the local musicians found out that a multimillionaire was visiting Bamako. And so they decided to go and sing his praises, a businessman. They decided to go and sing his praises in the hope of being sprayed a bit of cash. And Banning Eyre himself decided to join in, and sure enough, he did indeed make a few quid. So praise singing, as I say, is central to the story of traditional West African music. Not a good start in terms of music of resistance. Of course, praise singing is the antithesis of this. Praise singing is socially conservative. It makes the ruling classes feel good about themselves. But you know what? With culture, sometimes context is everything. And therefore, when this part of the world came under colonial control, actually to champion traditional music became an act of resistance to the sort of racist colonial mindset that would have been completely dismissive of indigenous culture. And in fact, when Senegal, for example, won its independence in 1960, my friend Doudou Sissoko, his dad, Sundinulu, sorry Doudou for pronouncing your dad's name wrong, Sundinulu Sissoko, was elevated by the new Prime Minister, Senghor. He was elevated to the status of a cultural icon in a deliberate attempt to try and create a new sense of national identity, a new sense of national pride. He was also a kora player, did I mention that? So music taken very seriously in post-independence, but also music played a role before independence had been won. Musicians played a role in the struggle for independence. Of course, they didn't play a primary role. The most important role was played by the rising levels of working class struggle, including industrial struggle. There have been rising levels of class struggle since the 1900s in this part of the world. The first general strike in Nigeria took place in 1945. It crippled the colonial regime for about 6 weeks. There was a very important strike on the railways in Senegal in 1947, and a whole layer of nationalist leaders emerged. Probably the most charismatic and radical was Kwame Nkrumah from what was then Gold Coast, now Ghana. And of course musicians responded to this rising tide of politicisation, to this rising struggle for independence. And high life in Ghana is a good example, actually, because high life began really as a celebration of drinking palm wine and having a good time. But increasingly, high life musicians started to write about the struggle. They started to get involved with the struggle. Sometimes they would change the name of their band in solidarity with the struggle for independence. A good example is a group who were called the Burma Jokers. But after the Accra riots of 1948, which were provoked by the colonial police killing several peaceful protesters, they changed their name to the Ghana Trio, and they dedicated themselves to do whatever they could as musicians for the struggle for independence. And you know what? Kwame Nkrumah took their potential contribution very seriously. He thought that musicians could indeed help to cohere people around a new sense of cultural pride and national identity, and therefore his party, the Convention People's Party, started to sponsor high life tours and concerts. And in fact, after Ghana became independent, Nkrumah issued a call to musicians and others, artists and intellectuals living in the diaspora, to come to Ghana, again to help to try to forge this new national identity. So you see culture, including music, being taken very seriously, both in the struggle for independence and in the immediate aftermath of independence being won. But there was a problem. There was a problem with the way that power changed hands in this part of the world, and the problem stems from the fact that no matter how radical the leader, they all presided over parties who had to some degree become Stalinised. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. These parties, many of them, said that they were practicing some form of Marxism-Leninism, but actually they weren't interested in leading the workers' struggle not only to victory over colonialism but on to workers' power and to socialism. They weren't interested in doing that. They weren't interested in securing what Trotsky refers to as permanent revolution. Instead, they thought that an African elite should negotiate independence with the old colonial power, and therefore the possibility of permanent revolution, to quote Tony Cliff, was deflected. This is actually what Tony Cliff said about that African elite. They are great believers in efficiency. They hope for reform from above and would dearly love to hand a new world over to a grateful people rather than to see the liberating struggle of a self-conscious and freely associated people result in a new world. Now, what this meant in practice is that a lot of ordinary West Africans quite quickly became disillusioned with the new governments. Workers increasingly came into conflict with those governments, and actually a lot of young West Africans felt that although colonialism had gone, that actually the powers that be were just copying the colonial sort of ways, that sometimes their parents' generation were trying to be more English than the English, or more French than the French. And they also didn't like to be told what music they should be into. They thought that the high life and the traditional African music was kind of passé. It didn't speak to their more radical desire to sort of reinvent who they were in this new era. So what they did, they most certainly didn't look to the old colonial powers. Instead, they looked across the Atlantic to the diaspora. They looked to Jamaican reggae, but most of all, they looked to American soul music. Now, soul music became absolutely massive at this time. A lot of the high life bands gave up playing high life altogether, and they became what they called copyright bands, essentially covers bands playing James Brown and other soul hits. You can see the influence of American soul styles in these brilliant photos by Malik Sidibe, taken in the early 70s in Mali, these particular ones. Now, just going to stop James Brown for a minute. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's an irony here, although I don't know that irony is quite the right word, but this was exactly the same time that a lot of African Americans were at least symbolically, looking to Africa for political inspiration. You know, they'd heard Malcolm X, they'd perhaps read Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and so on, and they were looking to Africa at precisely the same time that a lot of young West Africans were looking back. In fact, there's a joke that was going around Accra at the time, which goes like this. How do you tell the African Americans who were starting to visit Accra in delegations, how do you tell the African Americans apart from their Ghanaian hosts? The answer is that the African Americans are in the dashiki, the traditional African dress, and the Ghanaians are in the sharp American suits. Now, to the degree to which this was a conversation between young West Africans and the diaspora about how best to defeat neo-colonialism, how best to defeat racism, how best perhaps to end the Vietnam War and so on and be black and proud. To the degree to which that was the case, we have to say it was a brilliant thing, a fantastic and exciting development. But you know what? Oh, and in fact, some people did indeed see it in those terms. This is quite an interesting quote. This is Mantia Diawara, who is a Malian filmmaker and academic. He said this: "For me and many of my friends, to be liberated was to be exposed to more R&B songs and to be au courant of the latest exploits of Muhammad Ali, George Jackson, Angela Davis, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. These were becoming an alternate cultural capital for the African youth, imparting to us new structures of feeling and enabling us to subvert the hegemony of Francité after independence." But not everybody agreed. I mean, for one thing, several people felt that the term diaspora was meaningless if you applied it to soul music. This is what one Nigerian journalist wrote in 1969. The language is dated, but I'll read it anyway. "How on earth a Nigerian could condescend to soul? As the Nigerian James Browns wish us to believe, this soul thing is more than a dance, it's a fraternity. It is a black smoothness, negroid rhythm, the lot. I ask you, what is negroid about soul? The black Africans in Brazil use African musical instruments and really sweat it out to Umoja, the long-forgotten Yoruba goddess. What the American Negroes are doing and converting young Nigerians to is a perversion of the African beat." Perhaps more significantly, a number of political leaders and thinkers felt that actually this wasn't a particularly progressive thing at all, politically speaking, that in actual fact this was sort of the embrace of soul and all its style was really a celebration of US-style consumerism, was really an advert for the newest imperialist power on the block, was, if you like, a more ethnically accessible version of the American dream that was up for sale. Of course, this same debate, interestingly enough, this same debate goes on about hip-hop today in different parts of the world. In fact, I read a very interesting book called Hip Life about the contemporary Ghanaian music scene. And the author quotes an unnamed source in the US Embassy in Accra who says that the US actively promotes hip-hop in Africa because it acts as a good advert for the US and is a counterweight to radical Islam. Now, in the late 1960s, the discussion was about soul music. And in fact, Tanzania's Premier, Julius Nyerere, he actually banned soul music in 1969. It's said that Kwame Nkrumah also had reservations, but he didn't get a chance to elaborate on them because he was overthrown in what we now know was a CIA-backed coup in February 1966. Now, as revolutionary socialists, we don't call for music to be banned. That is not the right way to go. The best way would have been if somebody could have come along and taken the best bits of American soul and funk music and synthesised it into a distinctively West African form, and then added overtly political lyrics which criticised not only neo-colonialism and the activities of foreign companies, but also the African ruling classes as well. That would have been the best outcome. Luckily, one man stepped up to that task. He came from Nigeria, and his name is Fela Kuti. Now, there's so much that can be said about Fela Kuti. We could have had a whole meeting about him. It was a piece of his music that was playing as you were waiting for the meeting to begin. He created this form of music, Afrobeat, He thought that praise singers, he dismissed praise singers as being beggars, and he instead tapped into the lesser known tradition of abuse singing. Let me play you an excerpt from an interview with him, which I think must have been made in the early 1980s, because he's talking about Shigari, the first president to be elected after 13 years of military rule in Nigeria. Have a little look at this, and then I'll say some more.
There are many dangerous people in Africa. The president of Nigeria is dangerous. Shagari is dangerous. As a person himself, he's weak. But his surroundings, his administration is dangerous. He is not as dynamic to be as dangerous, but his setup is dangerous. Because they all say he's great and everything, but underneath, spoiling the whole continent, you understand? So it's dangerous. He has nothing to offer, he doesn't make big statements as such, but it's in Nigeria they come and do apartheid committee, apartheid this, a meeting in Namibia in Nigeria, everything Nigeria takes on its head. You see, but this country is a Gestapo country. How can Nigeria be talking about South Africa? You see, South Africa is better than Nigeria. I know so. But look, we are saying whites are mistreating blacks in South Africa. Okay, that is bad. That is racism. We have a reason to do it. Then blacks are mistreating blacks in Nigeria. What's the reason? That's worse. Police beat people on the streets like dogs. In South Africa, they do it, but they know they face public criticisms. So they watch themselves to do it. But in Nigeria, they say Nigeria is against apartheid. Nigeria is this, Nigeria is a good... In America, talks about Nigeria, like Nigeria is the greatest African country. But Nigeria is the worst African country. We have the worst things are happening. Worse than South Africa.
Lagos, capital city of Nigeria.
Okay. Now, I'm sure you can imagine these sorts of views being articulated by Fela Kuti were quite challenging, particularly to some African Americans who have black nationalist or Afrocentric politics, who thought that just getting rid of white colonial control, colonial rule would solve everything. It forced some people to go beyond just a racial or ethnocentric kind of analysis. Frantz Fanon, in his book The Wretched of the Earth, describes three phases that what he calls the native intellectual typically passes through. By the native intellectual, he means the sort of people who were leading the independence struggles right across Africa. These are the three phases that Frantz Fanon identified. Number one, strong identification with the colonial master, usually following a period of education in the colonial centre. Number two, a reaction to the first phase, during which the intellectual uncritically celebrates his native society, rejecting anything associated with the colonial master. Number three, the native intellectual outgrows the romanticisation of the previous phase, sharpen their critical thinking, and direct it towards his or her native society. Now, you can see Fela Kuti pretty much passing through exactly these three phases during the course of his life. He's born to a wealthy family. They're a political family, left-leaning, but nonetheless he comes from a privileged family. He's educated in London. He studies music at Trinity College. He's very keen on jazz. He hangs out in Ronnie Scott's quite a lot, playing his saxophone. And then he goes back to Nigeria and sets up a very jazz-influenced high life band. In fact, he sets it up in London, but he continues to play in a very jazz-influenced high life band called the Lobitos. Then, on an otherwise quite disastrous US tour, he meets a woman called Sandra Smith, who has been a Black Panther. I think she's been in prison accused of killing a policeman, well, I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong. But it's her, somewhat ironically, who introduces him to the ideas of Kwame Nkrumah, of Malcolm X, of Angela Davis and George Jackson, and so on. Some commentators say that Fela Kuti had to go to America to discover Africa. Certainly it was a key politicising moment for him. They had a relationship, Sandra Smith and him. He came back to Nigeria, started to work on this new sound, this new Afrobeat sound. He formed a band initially called Nigeria 70, although as he became more interested in Pan-Africanism, he changed the name to Africa 70. Recorded songs like By Africa, Black Man's Cry, and so on and so forth. But then he became really more and more of a maverick in lots of ways. He set up his own commune called the Calacuta Republic. He had his own venue, the Shrine, which was legendary at this time, and increasingly he came into conflict with the Nigerian authorities. He's briefly imprisoned in 1974. In 1977, the Nigerian authorities go in to his commune and arrest everyone, beat people up, people are tortured, the place is set on fire. Fela Kuti's mum is thrown out of the first floor window. She dies sometime afterwards. And really that war between Fela Kuti and his friends and followers and the Nigerian government continues for the rest of his life. He dies in the 1990s. Fela Kuti was always very keen to reach out to the poor, to ordinary people. He solved the question of language, which is posed to all post-colonial writers, really, by neither adopting Yoruba, his native language, which would have limited his audience, nor did he use the language of the colonial oppressor, in his case, English. Instead, he used a mixture of pidgin and slang, which really reached out to the urban poor in quite an effective way. But it would be untrue to say that he was a socialist. In fact, there are a few things about Fela Kuti that we would disagree with. For one thing, the depiction of women, both at his nightclub, The Shrine, and in at least two of his songs, is sexist. It's said that he ruled over his commune with an iron fist and that he treated his musicians quite badly. So he was most certainly a contradictory character. But I think that when you listen to his music, the sound that you hear is the closest sound that West Africa has produced so far to the sound of dissent. And I think that when you listen to his music, look at his work and look at his life, more than any other artist, he really embodies the complexities and contradictions of West Africa in this period. And therefore I think we should celebrate his work and the contribution that he's made and take it very seriously. As I say, there's lots more that can be said about Fela Kuti. I'm going to move on because I don't want to run out of time. I want to try to bring us up to date. But if you are interested, I can recommend this book by an American academic called Michael E. Veal. It's called Fela, The Life and Times of an African Musical Icon. It's very good indeed. I would recommend it if you want to know more about Fela Kuti. So, what about today? Who has stepped into Fela's shoes? What about the music of resistance now? Well, there's certainly a lot of interesting music which synthesises different forms from different parts of the world. A lot of it, of course, predictably, is synthesising American influences, hip-hop and R&B music. Let me play you a song that was on the radio all the time when I was in Ghana about 3 weeks ago. I'm going to play you an excerpt from that song and then talk a bit about it. This song is called Life, and the band is called R2Bs. Here we go.
Like gin, I go cross the line, I go win. I go bend back line from within. Tell them say we just get it in. R2Bs with a new religion. Oh, yeah. So keep doing what you're doing and don't watch nobody. Now if one listen, mankind go give you story, but in the end they go leave you lonely. So make your own story, yeah. Online, let me have a do the bank over. I keep moving on. I'm not gonna lose the title of my own now. Yeah, wallahi, but yeah, I'm doing the bank over. I keep moving on, I'm a soldier. I'm not gonna lose the title of my own now.
Okay. R2Bs with Life. Now, you could see that the band were keen to be pictured in front of a wall that had some icons of Pan-Africanism, some more dubious than others, we might say, Haile Selassie, Malcolm X, Kwame Nkrumah. But that really is about as political as the song gets. The chorus is, make your own story, Walai Babir Midruna Bankoma, which means, I swear to God that I will not go back to where I've come from. It's an aspirational song. It articulates the desire for a better life, but actually the conception of how to achieve it is quite individualistic. And this is fairly typical. Most of the pop music that you hear in West Africa at the moment is not overtly political. In fact, if you read interviews with the producers and artists, most of them actively avoid being overtly political because they're worried about alienating parts of their potential audience. There are some notable exceptions which I want to talk about very quickly because I've got to sum up soon. And then I'll try to contextualise them in the summing up. The first person you really should get a mention is Femi Kuti, Fela's son. He continues to make political Afrobeat. He plays at the New Shrine in Lagos still. His demands are less revolutionary than his dad's in lots of ways, and I've seen interviews with him when he sort of dismissed the political content of his work as being an excuse for people to let off steam. But he does indeed still talk out against neo-colonialism and the Nigerian elite. So there's Femi Kuti. There's some explicitly political hip-hop going on across West Africa. Most of it is fairly underground, but it's there. You've got Positive Black Soul in Senegal. You've got A+ in Ghana. There's also been some consistently political reggae coming out of the Ivory Coast. Chikunjar Fakali is one example. A better known example, probably, at least in this country, is Alpha Blondy. Let's have a quick blast of Alpha Blondy.
We want peace in Liberia, peace in Mauritania. We want peace in Liberia, peace in Mauritania. Say Babylon shall not rise again. Say Babylon shall not rise again. And Babylon shall not stand again. Say Babylon shall not stand again.
Okay, Alpha Blondy with Peace in Liberia. There's one other duo that I want to flag up. They're not taken completely seriously by... Well, it's hard to gauge, but a lot of people in Ghana don't take them that seriously. But I found out about a duo while I was over there who I find quite interesting because they've got a complete irreverence, almost like a punk attitude. They don't mind who they offend, and I think that's interesting. I've not come across that before coming from West Africa. They most certainly break the love affair with the US. They're very critical not only of Obama, which is, let's face it, an easy target these days, but even African Americans in general. They are critical in the most kind of crude, satirical way about the church, which is no small thing in a country like Nigeria. They call themselves the Fokken Boys, Foknbois, and well, let me play you a quick excerpt from a piece of music where they sort of describe themselves, and then I'll talk a little bit more about them. Fokken Boys from Ghana.
And even Mali's father, they have gone too far, but now going even farther. The KTM motorbike wonder, the rapper who they make more beats past even your producer. They're not underwear donor. They even true make a see come to the corner. The bastard right Fela Kuti truster, plantain and granite roaster, the pure water squeezer, the Obeli the baby concentra, the Ghana feeling brother, the friend of sexy motia brand, dry macho rapper, the ambulance created hip hop advocator, the hater of the skin bleacher, the Sankofa believer, hieroglyphics and even cross symbolist reader, the binary figure configuring calculator, potent ejaculator. Then you can teach me now, but wait when I catch you later. Or I replayer, the dummy gambler, the flat to make the earth rambler, the
Okay, Fockin' Boys from Ghana. Now, I mean, to take the punk analogy a bit further, who knows? Maybe these guys are the Johnny Rottens who paved the way for the Joe Strummers. Maybe they themselves would become more coherently political. I saw them play a tiny gig at about 2 o'clock in the morning at the Glastonbury Festival, and they did make time to talk about the disastrous invasion of Iraq by the US and Britain. I think they're worth looking out for. But the music, the examples that I've played you are not typical. As I say, most pop music isn't like that. And actually, when you turn on the radio, certainly in Ghana, what you're most likely to hear is gospel. It sounds a bit like Lovers Rock, but the lyrics are religious. So there's not that much music of resistance around at the moment, but I think that will change. And the reason why I think that will change is because there is a lot of anger in West Africa at the moment. The objective factors for rising levels of class struggle are are most definitely there. People are very poor, they're very angry about that. Life for most West Africans is tough, and this is true of the countries that they hail as being great economic success stories. I saw that with my own eyes in Ghana. People realise that the land is incredibly rich. It's rich in oil and gas and gold and diamonds and coca and timber and so on, and that they are being ripped off. Effectively, they're being ripped off by foreign companies and by the ruling classes of the countries themselves. So there's rising levels of anger, and that will soon become increasingly reflected in the music, I'm quite sure. The second thing to say is that what the ruling classes will do, as there is a rising level of class struggle, they'll do the same thing that the colonialists did. They'll try and divide people. It might take the form of religious sectarianism, Islamophobia, tribalism, who knows, but they will try to divide people. But the third thing is that I think that West Africa, with its incredibly rich musical tradition, I think that music is well positioned to act as a counterweight to counter those attempts by the ruling class. I think that in much the way that I argued at Marxism last year, that music performed this role in the Egyptian revolution at the beginning of 2011, I think that music is well placed in West Africa to cohere people around political demands and to give people the courage and the confidence to fight. Thank you for listening.
Just thank you for explaining what you talked about West Africa. I would like to know a few more things, if you know about what happened in Senegal last year with the group. Maybe you have more information which contributed in overthrowing the previous president. Did you hear about it? It was a rap music group which is called Yonama, and do you know them? Because they are not just doing music, but they were always in all the demonstrations against the establishment. You can give us some more information if you have about this.
Thank you very much. I think for my first conference, coming to this festival for the first time, is one of the highlights for me. It's a very, very good paper. Oh, not paper, but meeting, and it's very rich and very encouraging, and it makes me think about the things. I have one question and 3 or 4 comments. I'll be quick. The first question is the idea that you mentioned about these societies being rigidly class societies in West Africa for the last, I think, 2,000 years. You said. I'd like you to elaborate on that, because I think one of the stumbling blocks of Marxism in Africa has been, for some Marxists, has been a misunderstanding of the caste system, which is not, strictly speaking, a class system. So I'll be interested to see, for you to elaborate on that. The praise singing is very interesting. It's an aspect of the, historically speaking, of the Griot. But I think there's other layers to it as well. One being that on the battlefield, in the resistance against colonialism, on the battlefield, the Griot was there, like in danger, playing its instrument, encouraging the troops. It's a tradition that they have. But also at the same time, which is a tiny role, they were a true stellar to the king. Sometimes the king or the queen would listen to what the Griot of the family has to say, even if it is in private. So I'd like to to think about that as well. Sunjulu Sissoko was elevated for service to music. So it's the equivalent of the Queen Honors List. Basically, he has been at it for 30, 40, 50 years, and the president elevated him for that, for some l'ordre du mérite that he was given. So I think there's a political element there, but also recognition of his services to music in that part of the world. Last but not least, the idea of, I very much agree with most of the West African kind of elite, the way they Marxism and the Leninism worked from above. But Ghana is up to 62, 63, a exception. If you look at, I just want to mention one work by C.L.R. James, Nkrumah in the Ghana Revolution. He pretty much worked from 52 to 57 from the bottom up. This is it's an exception. And you have to think about it, he was the only guy, again, between the British, the French, and the other nations. That's why Guinea and Sékou Touré never went with the French, and you see how they went there. Okay. Last point I would like to make is the notion of the idea of the soul music influence. It's very important, but predominantly it's Afro-Cuban music that was predominant in terms of the influence. Manchegara is an Americanized version of his state. But I think look into the Afro-Cuban one, and if you think about it, a musician like Youssou N'Dour in Senegal, Mbalax is 100% African music. And it was a rebellion against the predominance of Afro-Cuban music. That's how Youssou N'Dour came into the scene and started Mbalax music. So, in a sense, it's politically a different way of resisting that soul and Afro-Cuban influence.
Soul was, the embrace of soul was a reaction to.
No. What I'm saying is that soul was, and James Brown and the American influence were there, but predominantly it was Afro-Cuban music, Pacheco and others.
Embraced.
Yes, that was predominant.
Right. Yeah.
Soul was second.
The question of radical music in West Africa, I think you have to look at it at the political development in each country, like what the previous speaker just said. You see, in Ghana what happened was that Nkrumah did not build a movement. He came to meet a movement that was struggling against colonialism. So when we had independence, every facet of that society struggled to change. From music, every phase of art, movies, painting, everything. We had to redo everything, including curriculum. So if you don't situate the changes of music in that milieu, then you don't get the picture. That is why you could see a whole lot of musicians who were Afrocentric, different ways of playing music. If you listen to Lord Kitchener, you would understand where Lord Kitchener's music garners independence. You understand the movement, what was happening in Ghana at that point. And the question of the praise singers could cause a revolution in a village or in a town, because they are the epitome of knowledge and history in each community. If you don't pay them, even if you are rich, they can sabotage you. If you don't give them money, they will insult you and tell you all the nasty things about your family, and everybody will get to know it. So they are kind of like, they could have their way out. And so in discussing this music, we have to split it in the political development. In the Francophone countries, it's a different thing altogether. They stopped Sékou Touré because they did not want Sékou Touré to implement what was happening in Ghana. They stripped the whole country from light bulbs to railway, and tables were stripped out of Guinea. Ghana had to give Guinea £10,000 loan. That is the situation in Guinea.
I really enjoyed that. The only thing that I just wondered, you didn't mention any women in your introduction, and I've met a member Sangera, and she's really interesting, and I think that women talk about revolutionary politics in a different way. And she sings about things like female mutilation, rape, and women's rights. And I wonder what your comments were on women that you met in West Africa and how you think their perspective in terms of music has been developed.
It's a big subject, isn't it? West African music of resistance. Of course, I've painted in broad brushstrokes. I think I mentioned more than just on with Sangare, at least at the beginning. Fatoumata Diawara, Rokia Traore, Amadou and Mariam, I think were all mentioned at the beginning of the meeting. But and yes, they've made a very important contribution to the West African musical scene, particularly recently. I also acknowledged, I think, that the scene can be quite male-dominated. So, I mean, the degree to which the women talk about revolutionary politics differently, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but I'd be interested to know more over a beer afterwards, though. What else? The question of class society for the last 2,000 years. Now, look, I'm not an expert on this, but there are two sources that I would recommend. One, of course, is Chris Harmon's People's History of the World. That's a concise way to get an overview of what's been going on. But if you want a bit more detail about the way that the class structures impact upon the psyche, if you like, of West African musicians now, I would again mention Banning Eyre's book, In Griot Time, because there's some fascinating stories that he tells about the almost sort of comical banter that goes on between different musicians. In fact, he talks about one incident where, I've forgotten who, it was an Ngoni player came to visit, I think, Jenny Madi Tunkara, so, both black Malians, and one says to the other, my slave, and the other one says, you were my slave. This kind of banter, comical banter, about who was where in these historical class structures. And Banning Eyre, who's a white American, says, my God, could you imagine saying such a thing in the US? So yeah, all I can really say is that those two books are both worth looking into. In terms of the griot tradition, absolutely. As I say, I'm painting in broad brushstrokes, and therefore this talk the introduction is inevitably going to lack some nuance. But I think, mention that Fela Kuti tapped into the lesser-known tradition of insults, of abuse singing, and I meant that. It is a tradition. It is indeed. It's got a rich history in West Africa, and it is absolutely true, as some of the contributors said, that griots play a number of different roles. But I think it's probably still true that they have had to be kinder about the ruling classes than they might choose on numerous occasions, because that's where their money comes from. I mean, the system of patronage has put musicians and other artists in that position in all parts of the world, actually. So I think that I think the problems associated with praise singing are still there, but it's absolutely true that griots play a number of different roles in West African societies. Yeah, absolutely, Sekou. Okay, the point about Afro-Cuban music being dominant, I'd love to learn more. I would love to respectfully learn more about that. I suspect, though, that preceded soul. I mean, if you look at Fela Kuti's decision to call his band Lobitos, his band when he first got back from London, I think that was really a reference to the Afro-Cuban influence, and so I think that probably the Afro-Cuban influence was big before soul became big in the late 60s. But again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm fascinated to learn more. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on the chronology of all these things. Now, likewise, when we talk about Ghana being the exception, up to 62, 63, I wish I had with me the book that Class Struggle in African Society. It was in the last meeting that Manny, I've forgotten the title of the book, but I've got it at home, and I can't remember the exact chronology of it. It's certainly true that Kwame Nkrumah played a very progressive role in lots of ways. I mean, with regard to the apartheid regime in South Africa, I think he more or less single-handedly got them booted out of the British Commonwealth, and that was a real setback for their credibility and so on and so forth. And the very fact that, in fact, what was the book that he wrote just before the CIA backed coup? I think it was, it sounded, it was an expose, really, of the way that multinational companies are working hand in glove. Yes, thank you. What was the full title?
The Last Stage of Imperialism.
Neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Well, after he published that, it's actually, I was reading Nkrumah actually for the first time a few months ago, and in some of his pamphlets, Class Struggle in Africa, there was very little that I would disagree with. It was very, very good. And when he released that book, that suddenly the CIA presence in Ghana doubled or tripled, and pretty soon he was toppled in this coup. So, you know, he was definitely a thorn in the side of the West in terms of their plans for the region. But it's also true that, I mean, maybe it was after 62, 63, but he crushed, he did his best to crush strikes, didn't he, and workers' movements in Ghana. So I think we have to say that he was a contradictory character and not somebody that could be trusted in the way that we would trust someone coming from our tradition. Sorry, that's a bit bitty. I just want to say thanks. It's been a brilliant discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to learning more.